So I want to talk about the United Nations and the World Food Programme abandoning and starving the most disadvantaged and poorest of men. And I want to talk about the media coverage and the false scholarship that leads to that happening. So mainly I'm talking about the United Nations and the World Food Programme, and I've put some links down in the description. The first link has a list of other links to mainly articles about gender mainstreaming, the United Nations policy of putting feminism at the centre of all things and making all other parts of the United Nations at least somewhat subservient to UN women, so everything has to be run by UN women, and this is done to make sure that feminist policies are always followed. And the second link down below is to an MRA blog which covers specifically the United Nations Women's Programme and a meeting by some feminist activists who work for the United Nations, in which they quite explicitly talk about using natural disasters to push a feminist political agenda. So the problem here is charities and the United Nations and the World Food Programme, people who should be helping the needy, instead focusing entirely on women, and in many cases excluding men from any help solely on the basis of their sex. And I'm going to be focusing mainly on, a few years ago, the World Food Programme's treatment of men in Haiti after a major earthquake there. And the third link down below is to a mainstream news article on this subject. And so here's what that article says. Relief workers began handing out women-only food coupons, launching a new phase of what they hope will be less cutthroat aid distribution to ensure that families and the weak get supplies, following Haiti's devastating earthquake. Young men often force their way to the front of aid delivery lines or steal from others, meaning aid doesn't reach the neediest at rough-and-tumble distribution centres, according to aid groups. The World Food Programme coupons can be turned in by women at 16 sites in the capital starting on Sunday, and entitle each family to £55 of rice. UN officials say they are still far short of reaching all 2 million quake victims estimated to need food aid. I suppose they thought it would be easy to push the idea that poor young black men were robbing people, but I looked into it, and as far as I can tell, there are no examples anywhere of robbery actually happening at aid distribution centres. In fact, they always seem to be guarded by soldiers and other armed men. In fact, the only example I could find of theft from aid distribution centres was in Haiti after the enactment of this policy, and that's because men were starving and hungry. So you get women being given, as it says, £55 of rice, which in many cases was more than those women could even lift. And so you get a little old woman with a big bag that she can't carry, going past all the men who are gathered outside the distribution centre, hoping that someone will give them food, and one of those men offers to help carry it. And as soon as you're out of sight of the armed guards, runs off with it. And I wasn't able to find any example of anything like that from any other case where the World Food Distribution Programme had handed out food. So it seems like stereotyping and demonisation being used as an excuse to just starve people. And here's another article, this one's from CNN. Pryor said the World Food Programme will work with its aid partners to ensure that men in need of assistance are not excluded. Women are receiving the food vouchers because they tend to be responsible for the household food supply, Pryor said. Our long experience in food distribution tells us that by delivering food into the hands of women, it is more likely to be redistributed equitably among the household, including the men, he said. Montournoy said that most men have someone, a wife, a sister, a mother or girlfriend, who will be able to feed them. He said it was safer to deliver the rice to the women. But things didn't sit well with some men. What about me? I didn't get anything. I need food, said Johnny Sanon Stevenson. Many people could not participate. So again, I looked into it, and I found many people at the time saying that they were going to have to break the rules or bend the rules to make sure men got fed, and that they hoped that aid partners and various charitable bodies would do that. I wasn't able to find a single example of anyone actually doing that, because they're all contracted, they're all contracted to the UN and the World Food Programme to hand out aid. So if they break the rules, then that's a great risk for them. So lots of people saying, I hope that men will get fed, but no one actually feeding them. I was able to find a report of a black market for food developing in Haiti, and it's rather strange to have a black market in something that's being handed out for free. But of course if it's only handed out to some people for free, then those people who are in need will obviously still need to acquire it somehow. Meanwhile, I found a report from the UN, I believe, I've lost track of it now, saying that they had distributed the food inefficiently because they'd given a lot of food to women who didn't actually need it, which is what happens when you distribute resources based on the fact that people are women rather than the fact that they're hungry. Now, the fourth link down below is to a gay human rights organisation who were active in Haiti at the time. And as you might expect, gay men had a bit of difficulty getting fed when they explicitly refused to feed men. And that document explains that gay men could get the aid coupons that were handed out to receive food aid, but they couldn't actually collect the food because only women were allowed to queue up to collect it. It also has a lot of other things to say. A lot of it is not really relevant here. A lot of it is special pleading. There's a lot of women who talk about how they didn't like to go and collect food. A lot of women apparently took men with them, so the lesbians, they didn't like to go and collect food because they didn't have men to go with them. Which, to me, seems like a much smaller issue than just being intentionally starved by the World Food Programme. But obviously, the gay people, they have different priorities. The gay human rights people, at least. So then there's link number 5 down below, which is a report, an academic report into the events in Haiti. And this is a very feminist report, but it does have an interesting quote from the head of the current executive director of the World Food Programme. In situations of desperate poverty, access to food is power. We allocate family food vouchers to women, and this changes the balance of power and helps protect them against violence. And that's an interesting quote, because most of the rest of the report is about how actually those women had been subject to a lot of violence, because they were given food, while the men were intentionally starved. So rather than choosing to die, those men simply went and took food from the people who had it. Again, what was supposed to be something that would stop men from stealing food actually provided a situation where men had no choice but to steal food, or to simply choose to starve. And that entire report, being very feminist, does focus on the threat to women of violence, and really pays very little attention to the threat to men from starvation. And I'm just saying that maybe the World Food Programme should focus on feeding people, hungry people for the most part, rather than focusing on trying to bring about some sort of gender revolution to enforce feminist social norms. So an obvious question, which you won't find in feminist reports such as that, is what effect did this have on men? Were there large numbers of deaths as a result? Were there people starving? And that's a very difficult question to answer. I haven't been able to find any UN reports that even ask the question, or even speculate that they could have had any effect on men. If you read that last report in the 5th link down below, there's a lot of talk about men who are doing violence to try and feed themselves, but that's about it. It's all focused on how that affects women. So the effect on men is completely ignored. Because again, the World Food Programme's priority is a political feminist agenda, and not just feeding hungry people. And you won't find any information from reporters either. Whenever I've found any news coverage of this sort of thing, it's all from the point of view of a journalist who is inside the barbed wire. The armed men protecting the distribution centres protect them from being able to get to the truth. The women come in, they get food, they go out. The journalists never even talk to any of the men. They just see the hungry crowds waiting outside the distribution centres. So the 6th link down below is a Reddit post from someone who claims to have worked for the UN in Haiti and in other various disaster areas. And he's talking about the same thing that I'm talking about today. His belief is that hundreds of thousands of men have died over the last few years as a result of these policies and the neglect that men experience, not just from food distribution, but in medical treatment, in refugee provision for being allowed to flee war zones. And he specifically mentions the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and the known focus on women for prevention and for treatment, even though women were not more likely to be affected by the disease. And all of this, of course, is to be expected because it's part of the UN's official policy as a result of the mainstreaming gender approach taken by UN women. And there was a similar approach to COVID vaccine distribution. In Portugal, for example, women were given the mRNA vaccine, which is more effective. Men were given the cheaper vaccine, and even though they had a higher death rate, were given less protection. And these policies continue to this day. So in Yemen, for example, the World Food Programme continued to focus entirely on women. And in Venezuela, on the border with Colombia, there's also a program to provide aid, and that also focuses on providing food and shelter exclusively to women and children. Even while worldwide, men and boys are more likely to suffer from undernutrition and malnutrition than women. And so that brings us to the last link down in the description. And to push any kind of hatred and any sort of discriminatory policy like this, you always need an excuse. You need a fig leaf to cover up what you're doing. In this case, you need some lies. You need some propaganda. It's a form of stochastic terrorism, I suppose. So here, it's a figure put about by the UN that women and girls are 14 times as likely as men and boys to die after a natural disaster. And this figure is completely untrue. So the link is to a Reddit post where someone has done some pretty in-depth research into where this idea comes from. And this is quite a feminist thing. It's sometimes called the woozle effect, or evidence by citation. It's to make a claim and then to cite someone else who made that claim, who cites someone else, who cites someone else, and to never actually get back to any sort of real source of information, any sort of scientific journal or other rigorously sourced information. So that last link, the Reddit post, takes that source and gets back to where it originally comes from, through a UN report which says women and children, which obviously lumps in women with children, who are far more vulnerable than women are, traces it back from there to a University of Colorado report. And the University of Colorado does give that number, but doesn't give an actual source for that number. And ultimately that number is traced back to a nature priestess, who attributes it to traditional sources of knowledge. So, in other words, some insane person made the number up and has absolutely no source for it, and you peddle it, you launder the information through a few feminist sources and a few UN reports, and then there are natural disasters that lead to men just being intentionally starved by international aid agencies. That's how feminism works. Crazy person makes up a lie, idiots believe it, and then the government harms men as a result of that information, or that fake information. That's how stochastic terrorism works as well. It's a bit of a buzzword, stochastic terrorism, but this is basically what it is. You spread some false information, which is not explicitly calling for violence or harm to a group, but which inevitably leads to that group being more likely to become a victim, or more likely to become disadvantaged in some way. And so, that's how the UN and the World Food Programme decided to start starving men and boys in disaster areas. And I hope it's somewhat illustrative of how feminism works.